My father used my college fund on his new family and borrowed $15K from me. But when I asked for it back for my wedding, he refused because of racism. Then my grandfather disinherited him and gave me the house. Now I charge him rent and discovered he was stealing money from his daughters to keep a mistress. I'm 33 years old, I work in finance, and I need to get this story off my chest because what happened last year basically destroyed whatever relationship I could have had with my father. And when I say destroyed, I mean I literally left him homeless, and now I charge him rent to live in what is technically my property. Sounds brutal. I know. But when you hear the whole story, you're going to understand why we got to this point. I guess I should start at the beginning. When my parents got divorced. I was like 10 years old. I think I was in 5th grade, and honestly, it wasn't a surprise to anyone. My mom, Ruth, and my dad, Peter, had been fighting about everything for years, like everything. Money, work, family, literally anything could turn into an all-out war in my house. And me, as the only child at that point, ended up being the messenger between them. You know, that super healthy role that definitely doesn't leave you with lifelong trauma. My mom would tell me, "Tell your father I need money for groceries," and my dad would respond, "Tell your mother I already gave her enough last week." Like that for years until they finally separated. And honestly, it was a relief when it happened. After the divorce, I lived mainly with my mom because she had a stable job and a decent apartment, while my father basically bounced between friends' houses and eventually moved in with my grandparents, Francis and Mildred. My grandfather, Francis, was always cool with me. He'd let me stay with them on weekends, when my dad supposedly had custody. But in reality, my dad would go out with his friends, and I'd stay watching TV with my grandparents. Not complaining. My grandma Mildred made the best cookies, and my grandpa taught me how to play chess, so those moments were good memories in the midst of all the chaos. Things changed. When I was like 15, and my dad met Stephanie, she was, or well, is, because I still consider her family, even though she's no longer with my father, a really kind woman. She worked as a nurse, had a daughter my age named Allison, and honestly brought a completely different energy than what I had known with my parents. She was organized, practical, and seemed genuinely interested in creating a functional family. When they got married, I was optimistic. I thought maybe my dad would finally mature and become a decent father. Allison and I got along well from the start. She was quieter than me, but we shared a love for horror movies and video games. So we had that sibling bond that naturally forms when you've both lived through complicated divorces. Everything seemed to be going relatively well until it was time to go to college. I was 18 years old, had applied to several universities, and got into a pretty good one in another state. For years, since I was a kid, my dad had told me he had a savings fund for my education, not to worry about money because he would take care of everything. Turns out when the time came to pay, my dad sat me down in his living room, with Stephanie there present, and told me he was sorry but he couldn't pay for my college. That the money he had saved he needed for his new family, for the house, for Allison's expenses, for a bunch of things that basically boiled down to, "You're no longer my priority." I sat there processing what I had just heard, feeling my stomach drop to the floor, and all I could say was, "Seriously? After promising me for years you'd be there?" And he just shrugged and said something like, "Things change, Adrian. You have to understand." Stephanie looked uncomfortable during that whole conversation. I could tell, but she didn't say anything. My mom ended up helping me with student loans, and I worked 2 jobs throughout college to be able to pay my expenses. It was hard, I'm not gonna lie, but it also taught me not to depend on my father for anything. During those college years, I barely spoke to him. Maybe short calls at Christmas or birthdays, but nothing substantial. I built my life without him, graduated, got a good job in finance, and basically moved on. When I was like 23, Stephanie had a baby, my half-sister Isabella. There was a huge age gap between us. Like I was already working full-time when she was born, but when I met her, I felt that protective older brother instinct. She was a cute baby, with huge cheeks and an easy laugh, and despite all the resentment I felt toward my father, I couldn't blame this little kid for anything. The situation took an unexpected turn when I was 25 years old. My father called me, which he almost never did, and asked me to meet him for coffee. I went, more out of curiosity than desire to see him, and there he dropped the bomb. Turns out he needed money for Allison's college. He explained that when Isabella was like 2 years old, she had a medical emergency, something with her heart, and they had to operate on her urgently. The medical expenses were huge, he told me, and he had to use Allison's college fund to be able to pay for everything, because insurance didn't cover certain procedures. Now Allison was ready to go to college, and they didn't have money to pay for her. He asked if I could lend him money. Not for him, obviously, but for Allison, because she wasn't to blame for any of this. And here's where I probably did something a lot of people would criticize. But the truth is, I cared about Allison. We had kept sporadic contact through social media. She had supported me when my dad disapproved of some of my life decisions, and I knew she was a good kid who deserved to go to college. So I told my father, "Okay, I'm going to help, but with one condition. You have to be honest with Stephanie about what you did with Allison's money. You can't keep having financial secrets in your marriage. That's exactly what destroyed your marriage with Mom." My father agreed, or at least, said he would, and I lent him a considerable amount of money, with the promise that he would pay me back in monthly installments. Like 2 years passed, and my father hadn't paid a single cent of what he owed me. I didn't push much because honestly, I didn't need the money urgently, and Allison was in college doing well. So let's say I let it slide. But then I met Ariana. Ariana is, the love of my life. We met at work. She worked in another department, and we connected instantly. She's smart, funny, ambitious, and has this way of seeing the world that makes me want to be a better person. We dated for 1.5 years before I proposed, and when she said yes, I literally felt like my life was finally in the right place. There was one thing. Ariana is of Afghan descent. Her parents immigrated when she was a kid, and she maintains a strong connection to her culture. For me, that was never a problem, obviously, but when I told my father about the engagement, his reaction was anything but positive. My father basically told me I was making a mistake, that cultural differences were going to be a problem, that he didn't understand why I couldn't find a normal girl, and a bunch of comments that basically revealed a racism I honestly didn't know he had, or maybe I just never paid attention before. We had a horrible argument over the phone where I basically told him his opinion about my love life didn't matter to me, and that if he couldn't respect my future wife, then he wasn't welcome in my life. He responded with something like, "You'll see that I'm right," and hung up. A couple of months later, when we were planning the wedding, I realized we needed extra money for some expenses. Ariana's family was contributing quite a bit. My mom Ruth was also helping as much as she could, but we were still short for the reception venue we really wanted. Then I remembered my father owed me like $15,000, like a not insignificant amount. And I thought, well, it's time for him to pay. I sent him a detailed email explaining the situation and asking him to start making payments because I needed that money for the wedding. His response was basically, "I'm not going to give you money to marry that woman. I warned you it was a mistake and I'm not going to be complicit in it." That's when something in me broke, you know? It wasn't just about the money. It was about years of broken promises, of being used as a messenger as a kid, of him using the money that was supposedly for my education on his new family, of lending him money he never planned to return, of criticizing the woman I love just because she doesn't fit into his narrow vision of the world. I was fed up, completely fed up with his shit. So I did something that maybe was petty, maybe was vindictive, but honestly I felt it was necessary. I sent a detailed message to the entire family. And when I say entire, I mean Ruth, Stephanie, Allison, and my grandfather, Francis. In that message I explained everything. How my father had broken his promise to pay for my college, how he had borrowed money from me, supposedly for Allison, using the excuse of Isabella's medical expenses, how he hadn't paid a single cent in 2 years, and how now he refused to pay me because he didn't approve of my marriage for racist reasons. I didn't leave anything out. I put all the cards on the table. The responses started coming in within hours. My mom Ruth sent me a message saying she was proud that I finally stood up to him. Allison wrote, apologizing for not knowing my father owed me money for her college. She thought Stephanie had handled all that. Stephanie called me directly. She sounded like she had been crying, and asked me about the details of Isabella's medical expenses. That's when things got really interesting. Turns out, my grandfather Francis called me like an hour after I sent the message. He said, "Adrian, I need to tell you something about those medical expenses for Isabella. I paid those bills. All of them." When Peter told me he needed money for my granddaughter's operation, I gave him a check for the full amount. He never had to use Allison's money for anything, because I took care of everything. I was silent processing that. My dad had lied. He hadn't just broken promises and manipulated situations. He had blatantly lied about why he needed money, using his own daughter's health as an excuse to steal another daughter's college fund. It was disgusting. It was unforgivable. It was exactly the type of behavior I had seen between my parents when I was a kid, but taken to a completely new level. My grandfather continued talking. His voice sounded tired but determined. He said, "I've been thinking a lot about this, Adrian, about how my son has behaved toward you and his family. And I've decided to do something I probably should have done years ago. The house where Peter lives, the house that's technically mine because I bought it decades ago and have just let him live there, I'm going to transfer the property to your name as a wedding gift. Consider this my way of apologizing for having raised a son who has failed you so consistently." I couldn't believe it. I was literally speechless. My grandfather was basically kicking my father out of his house. Well, not physically kicking him out, but taking away the security of having a place to live without consequences. It was the perfect revenge, karma in its purest form. I told my grandfather, "You don't have to do that. I don't want to cause more problems in the family." But he insisted, said it was already decided and the papers were already in process with his lawyer. He told me, "Your father needs to learn that actions have consequences, and if I keep protecting him from those consequences, he's never going to change." The next few days were absolute chaos. My father sent me like 20 emails and called me I don't know how many times, all blocked obviously, but Allison kept sending me screenshots. In the messages, my father basically begged, said it was all a misunderstanding, that he could explain everything, to please talk to my grandfather to reverse the decision, that he had nowhere to go, that this was going to leave him on the street, basically all the drama you can imagine. But I didn't respond to a single one of those messages. I went ahead with the wedding plans. Ariana and I got married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by people who really loved and supported us. My mom, Ruth, was there with her new partner. Stephanie came with Allison and Isabella. My grandfather, Francis, and my grandmother, Mildred, were in the front row, and all my friends and Ariana's family. The only person noticeably absent was my father, and honestly, the wedding was better without him. We went on our honeymoon to Italy for 2 weeks. I disconnected completely, blocked all social media, and just enjoyed being with my wife in one of the happiest moments of my life. When we got back from the honeymoon, I had like 50 unread messages from various family members. I thought, well, here we go, probably more drama from my father. But when I started reading the messages, I realized the drama was much worse than I had imagined. Stephanie had sent me a long message explaining that after I exposed my father's lies, she started investigating the family finances more deeply. She checked bank statements, credit cards, receipts, everything she could find. And she discovered that for the last 3 years, my father had been withdrawing large amounts of money from their joint accounts without explanation. When she confronted him, he initially said it was for work expenses, then changed his story saying it was to help a friend. Basically, his lies didn't add up. Stephanie didn't settle for those answers and hired a private investigator. Turns out my father had been having an affair with a coworker for years, and the money was going toward maintaining that parallel relationship, like paying for an apartment, dinners, trips, gifts, the whole infidelity package with a budget. The money he supposedly used from Allison's college fund, the money my grandfather had given him for Isabella's medical expenses, all of it had partially gone to maintain this affair. Not all of it, obviously, but a significant portion. My father had stolen from his daughter's futures to keep his mistress. It was so sick, so twisted, that even I, who already had a very low opinion of him, was shocked. Stephanie told me in her message that she had gotten the girls out of the house. They had temporarily moved in with her mom while she processed everything, and that she had already hired a divorce lawyer. She said she was sorry for not believing me more when I was young and complained about how my father handled money, that she thought they were just father-son problems. But now she saw the complete pattern of manipulation and lies. I felt bad for Stephanie, for Allison, for Isabella. All of them were innocent victims of my father's actions just like me. I responded to Stephanie saying I supported her completely and that if she needed anything at all, to let me know. I also told her that regarding the house, which was technically mine now, my father could stay there temporarily, but he was going to have to start paying rent. And that's how we got to the present. My father now pays me rent to live in what is technically my house, a fair amount based on the rental market in the area, and I split that money between my mom, Ruth, and Stephanie. Ruth, because she deserves some compensation for all the years she essentially raised me alone, and Stephanie because she's going through a difficult divorce and needs financial support while she stabilizes. My father knows where the money goes, I told him directly, and his humiliation is palpable in every interaction we have, which are few and strictly about rent payment. Allison is finishing her last year of college. Isabella is in therapy, processing her parents' divorce, but she's okay considering everything. And Stephanie got a better job at another hospital that pays more. My mom, Ruth, is happy. She has a stable relationship and says that seeing me stand up to my father was the best thing that could have happened. My grandfather, Francis, visits me often, sometimes with my grandmother, Mildred, and tells me he's proud of how I handled everything, though I know it hurts him to have had to take such drastic measures against his own son. As for my father, I haven't seen him in person since before the wedding. I know he works, pays his rent on time because he has no other choice, and apparently ended things with his mistress when everything came to light. I don't feel sorry for him. Honestly, he had decades to be a decent father, to be an honest husband, to simply be a person of integrity, and he chose otherwise every time. The consequences he's living with now are entirely of his own making. Ariana and I are doing well. Better than well, actually. We're thinking about buying our own house soon. Maybe start thinking about having kids in a couple of years. She knows the whole story with my father and supports me completely. Sometimes she asks me if I would ever consider forgiving him or trying to rebuild the relationship. And my honest answer is I don't know. Maybe at some future point when he's demonstrated real and lasting change, but for now, keeping distance is the healthiest thing for me. What I do know is that when I have my own kids someday, I'm going to break the cycle of empty promises and manipulation that defined my relationship with my father. I'm going to be present, I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to prioritize their well-being over my own selfish desires. Because at the end of the day, that's what being a father means, something my father never understood and probably never will understand. And I guess that's the most valuable lesson I got from all of this, learning exactly what kind of father I don't want to be by watching my own father's example. It's a bitter lesson. But at least now I know exactly what mistakes to avoid.